"Don't waste food on her," my son's wife whispered to the caterer at my own birthday party. "She barely eats anything anyway, and it's expensive." I stood frozen behind the kitchen door, hearing how little I meant to the family I'd been financially supporting for years. What I did next with my checkbook left them all scrambling. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought that at 70 years old, I'd discovered that my own family saw me as a burden not worth feeding properly. My name is Evelyn Rosewood, and I thought I'd learned all there was to know about heartbreak when I lost my husband Theodore 5 years ago in the quiet town of Millbrook, Connecticut. But standing in my son Christopher's kitchen that crisp September evening, overhearing those cruel words about my own birthday celebration, I realized there were still new ways for people to shatter your heart into pieces you didn't know existed. Theodore and I had lived a good life together. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we were comfortable. He'd worked as a mechanical engineer at Pratt & Whitney for 37 years, and I'd spent my career as a librarian at Millbrook Elementary School. We'd saved diligently, lived modestly, and by the time Theodore passed from a sudden heart attack at age 72, we'd accumulated a decent nest egg. The life insurance payout had been substantial, and combined with our retirement savings and the equity in our home on Maple Avenue, I found myself in the unexpected position of having more money than I'd ever imagined I'd need in my remaining years. For the past 3 years, since Theodore's funeral at St. Margaret's Church on Elm Street, I'd been what you might generously call the family benefactor. My son Christopher and his wife Natasha had been struggling financially ever since Christopher's advertising agency had downsized and he'd been forced to take a lower-paying position at a smaller firm in Hartford. When their second daughter was born, Natasha had to leave her job as a dental hygienist to care for the children, and their household income had been cut nearly in half. I'd stepped in without hesitation. Monthly contributions of $2,000 to help with their mortgage on the beautiful colonial house in West Hartford that they'd bought when times were better. Private school tuition at Sacred Heart Academy for my granddaughters Isabella and Sophia, ages 9 and 13, because Natasha insisted the public schools weren't good enough for her daughters. Car payments when Christopher's Honda died and they needed something reliable. Vacation funds when Natasha declared they desperately needed family time in Martha's Vineyard to help the girls maintain their social connections with their private school friends. The requests had started small and seemingly reasonable. "Mom, could you help us out with groceries this month?" Christopher's commission check was smaller than expected. Then they grew larger and more frequent. "The girls really need new computers for school, and you know how important their education is. Isabella wants to take horseback riding lessons like her friends, and we just can't swing it right now. The roof needs repairs, and if we don't fix it soon, we'll have water damage." Before I knew it, I was funding their entire lifestyle. The mortgage payments, the private school tuition, the car payments, the vacation funds, the emergency repairs, the extracurricular activities, the designer clothes Natasha deemed necessary for the girls to fit in with their classmates. Probably close to $90,000 over the past 3 years. Money from Theodore's life insurance and our retirement savings that I'd been happy to share because Christopher was my only child, my only family, and I wanted his daughters to have every opportunity Theodore and I had worked so hard to provide. I lived alone now, in the house Theodore and I had shared for 42 years on Maple Avenue, a modest 3-bedroom colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch that desperately needed painting. The garden that Theodore had lovingly tended, with its prize-winning roses and carefully planned vegetable plots, was now mostly weeds, despite my best efforts. My arthritic hands couldn't manage the heavy work anymore, and my back ached after even light gardening. Hiring a landscaper felt like an unnecessary expense when there were so many other ways I could help my family instead. The house felt enormous without Theodore's presence filling it. His reading chair in the living room sat empty, the leather worn smooth from decades of use. His coffee mug still sat in the kitchen cabinet, the one with "World's Best Husband" that I'd given him for Father's Day 20 years ago. I couldn't bring myself to pack away his clothes, so his side of the closet remained exactly as he left it, his work shirts still pressed and hanging in neat rows, his favorite cardigan draped over the chair where he'd left it the night before he died. My days had settled into a quiet routine that would have felt unbearably lonely if I'd allowed myself to dwell on it.
I woke each morning at 6:30, just as I had when Theodore was alive. My body still programmed to his schedule, even though there was no longer any reason to rise so early. I'd make coffee in the same blue ceramic mug I'd used for 20 years, the one Theodore had brought me from a business trip to Seattle, and sit at the kitchen table reading the Hartford Courant while the morning sun streamed through the lace curtains his mother had made for us as a wedding gift in 1975.
Breakfast was always the same. Toast with a thin layer of strawberry jam and half a grapefruit. Theodore used to tease me about my unchanging morning routine, calling me his creature of habit. But the familiarity was comforting now. It was a connection to our life together, a way of maintaining some continuity in a world that had been turned upside down by his absence. After breakfast, I'd spend an hour or two dealing with correspondence and household tasks that seemed to multiply despite the fact that I was just one person living in the house now. Bills to pay, insurance forms to complete, maintenance issues that cropped up with annoying frequency in a 40-year-old house. The furnace making strange noises, the kitchen faucet developing a persistent drip, the front steps becoming loose and wobbly. Each problem felt overwhelming without Theodore there to handle it, or at least discuss the options with me. Afternoons were for reading, though my eyes tired more easily now, and I found myself rereading the same paragraphs multiple times before the words would sink in. I'd loved books my entire life, had built my career around connecting children with stories that would spark their imaginations. But now even my favorite novels felt distant and hard to focus on. The silence in the house was so complete that sometimes I'd turn on the television just for the sound of human voices, even if I wasn't really watching whatever program was playing. The loneliness was worst in the evenings. That had always been our time together, Theodore and me. We'd share dinner and talk about our days, watch the news, work on crossword puzzles together. He'd been my best friend for 47 years, the person I told everything to, the one who made me laugh even when I was frustrated or sad. Without him, the hours between dinner and bedtime stretched endlessly, filled with nothing but the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the creaking of an old house settling for the night. That's why Sunday dinners at Christopher and Natasha's house had become so precious to me. Those few hours each week when I could feel like I was still part of a family, rather than just an elderly woman rattling around in an empty house filled with memories. I'd drive the 20 minutes to West Hartford in my aging but reliable Toyota Camry, always bringing a homemade dessert because baking was one of the few skills from my younger years that hadn't abandoned me. The drive itself had become part of the ritual. I'd take Route 44 through the center of Millbrook, past the elementary school where I'd worked for 31 years, past the church where Theodore and I had been married and where his funeral had been held, past the small downtown area with its antique shops and the diner where we used to have breakfast on Saturday mornings, then out onto the highway toward West Hartford, watching the landscape change from small-town New England to suburban affluence as I got closer to Christopher's neighborhood. Isabella, at 9, still had that pure childhood enthusiasm that made everything seem magical. She'd run to greet me at the door before I could even ring the bell, her face lighting up with genuine joy at seeing her grandmother. "Grandma Evelyn! Grandma Evelyn!" she'd call out, throwing her arms around my waist and chattering immediately about school and friends and the latest book she was reading. She was a voracious reader, just like I'd been at her age, and I loved hearing about her adventures with the characters in whatever series had captured her imagination that week. Sophia, at 13, was entering that complicated teenage phase, where she was sometimes too cool for grandmother hugs, but she still lit up when I asked about her violin lessons or her grades at Sacred Heart Academy. She was becoming quite accomplished on the violin, practicing diligently and performing in school recitals that filled me with pride. I'd sit in the auditorium at Sacred Heart, surrounded by other grandparents and parents, watching my granddaughter play with such focus and skill, thinking about how Theodore would have beamed with pride if he could have been there to see her. Those girls were my joy, my reason for getting up each morning, the living connection to Theodore and the life we'd built together.
When I looked at Isabella's bright smile, I could see Christopher at that age, full of curiosity and mischief. When Sophia played her violin with such concentration, I remembered the young woman I'd been when I first held Christopher as a baby, dreaming about all the possibilities that lay ahead for him. Christopher had been such a sweet child, always eager to please, always ready with a hug or a silly joke to cheer me up when I'd had a difficult day at the library. He'd been artistic, spending hours drawing elaborate pictures that covered every surface in his bedroom, talking about becoming a famous artist someday. I'd encouraged his creativity, enrolling him in art classes and buying him expensive supplies even when money was tight. Theodore and I had dreamed of him going to art school, maybe becoming a painter or an illustrator. But life had a way of redirecting dreams towards practical considerations. Christopher had been talented enough to get into art school, but the financial realities of student loans and uncertain career prospects led him towards advertising instead. "I can still be creative," he'd assured us, "but I'll also be able to support a family someday." It had made sense at the time, and he'd done well in his advertising career for many years, working his way up to account supervisor at a mid-sized agency in Hartford.
The downsizing that had cost Christopher his job 3 years ago had been devastating for their family. One day he was a successful account supervisor with a comfortable salary and good benefits. The next day he was unemployed in a competitive job market that favored younger candidates with more recent training in digital marketing. He'd eventually found work at a smaller agency, but the pay was significantly less, and the position felt like a step backward in his career. That's when the financial requests had started. Not demands, never demands. Christopher was too polite for that, too aware of proper boundaries between adult children and their parents. But requests, gentle suggestions, hints about difficulties they were facing and ways I might be able to help. And I'd been happy to help, eager to make their lives easier, grateful to feel needed and useful in a way I hadn't since Theodore's death. Natasha had always been polite to me, if somewhat distant. She was a striking woman, tall and blonde, with the kind of effortless elegance that made expensive clothes look even more expensive. She'd grown up in Westport, in a family with old Connecticut money that had been lost through bad investments and her father's gambling problems, though she rarely talked about her childhood. Sometimes I felt like she viewed Christopher's middle-class upbringing, and by extension me, as something to be tolerated rather than embraced. But she was the mother of my granddaughters, and she seemed to love Christopher genuinely, and I was grateful that she included me in their family gatherings and holidays. She'd always been gracious about my Sunday visits, setting a place for me at their dining room table and asking polite questions about my week. She remembered to call me on holidays and send me photos of the girls when they achieved something special at school. Over the past 3 years, as my financial support had become more central to their lifestyle, Natasha had become warmer toward me, more inclusive, more appreciative. She'd started calling me Mother Rosewood instead of just Evelyn, and she'd begun involving me more in decisions about the girls' activities and education. I'd felt like I was finally being accepted as a true member of their family, rather than just Christopher's mother who visited on Sundays. That's why I'd been so genuinely touched and surprised when Natasha called me 3 weeks before my 70th birthday with an unexpected and wonderful suggestion. "Mother Rosewood," she'd said in that cultured voice of hers, "Christopher and I have been talking, and we think it's time we do something special for your birthday. 70 is a major milestone, and you've done so much for our family over the years. We'd like to throw you a party." The offer had caught me completely off guard. For the past 2 years, my birthdays had been quiet, subdued affairs. Christopher's family would take me to dinner at the Millbrook Inn, we'd have cake afterward at their house, the girls would give me homemade cards with sweet messages, and that was it. Pleasant enough, but hardly the kind of celebration that made you feel truly special or valued. The idea of a real party with guests and decorations and genuine celebration made my heart flutter with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. When was the last time anyone had gone to real trouble for me? When was the last time I'd been the center of attention in a positive way, surrounded by people who cared about me and wanted to mark another year of my life?
We could invite all your old friends from the library, Natasha had continued enthusiastically, and maybe some of the neighbors you're close to, Mrs. Patterson from next door, and that nice couple from church, the Hendersons. We'll make it really special. I was thinking we could hire a caterer, get some beautiful flowers, maybe even have a small band or pianist to provide background music. I'd been so moved by her thoughtfulness that I'd actually teared up on the phone, grateful that she couldn't see my emotional response. No one had suggested doing anything like this for me since Theodore's death. The idea that Christopher and Natasha wanted to celebrate me, to make me feel special and valued, filled me with a warmth I hadn't experienced in months. Natasha, that sounds absolutely wonderful, I'd managed to say, but I don't want you and Christopher spending money you don't have on my party. I know things are still tight for you. Don't worry about that, she'd said quickly, almost dismissively. We want to do this for you. You deserve it. You've been so generous with our family, and we want to show you how much we appreciate everything you've done for us. But as the weeks progressed and the party plans became increasingly elaborate, I began to worry about the expense. Natasha was talking about hiring Prestige Catering, one of the most expensive catering services in the Hartford area, known for serving the country club set and high-end corporate events. She'd mentioned ordering flowers from Henry's Fine Florals in Westport, a shop that charged premium prices for their arrangements. She wanted to hire Marcus Webb, a jazz pianist who performed at expensive weddings in Greenwich and charged accordingly. It all sounded lovely, incredibly thoughtful and generous, but I knew Christopher and Natasha's budget couldn't handle such extravagance. They were still receiving my monthly checks to help with their mortgage, and Isabella needed new orthodontic work that wasn't fully covered by their insurance. The idea that they might go into debt to throw me a party made me feel guilty rather than grateful. Please, I'd finally said during one of our planning calls, let me pay for the catering and flowers. It's my party after all, and I want to contribute. You're already doing so much organizing everything and opening your home.
Natasha had protested, but not very strongly or for very long, and eventually she'd agreed to let me cover the major expenses. If you insist, Mother Rosewood, but this is supposed to be our gift to you. I'd written a check for $3,500 to cover the caterer, flowers, and pianist, money that I was happy to spend because it meant I'd be surrounded by friends and family, celebrating not just another year of life, but the connections that made that life meaningful. The week before the party, I'd driven to Nordstrom in West Hartford to buy a new dress. I hadn't purchased anything for myself in months, having gotten into the habit of spending money on Christopher's family instead of my own needs, but this felt like a special occasion worth marking. I'd spent an hour in the women's department, trying on different options and asking the sales associate for her opinion. I'd finally chosen a navy blue dress with a subtle floral pattern, elegant but not flashy, appropriate for a woman my age, but still festive enough for a party. I'd even splurged on new shoes and a matching handbag, items I definitely didn't need, but that made me feel special and celebratory. Looking at myself in the fitting room mirror, I'd felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation, joy, the sense that something wonderful was about to happen. I'd spent the morning of my birthday at Bella's beauty salon on Main Street, getting my gray hair styled in soft waves instead of the practical bob I usually wore. The stylist, a young woman named Ashley, who'd been cutting my hair for 2 years, had even convinced me to let her apply a light touch of makeup. "It's your special day, Mrs. Rosewood," she'd said with a warm smile. "Let's make you feel glamorous." When I looked in the salon mirror afterward, I saw not just the 70-year-old widow I'd become accustomed to, but a woman who was still vital, still attractive, still worth celebrating and making a fuss over. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about the evening ahead. I'd arrived at Christopher and Natasha's house on Prospect Avenue 2 hours before the party was scheduled to begin, eager to see how everything looked and to spend some extra time with Isabella and Sophia before the guests arrived. The girls had been beside themselves with excitement, running to hug me the moment I walked through the front door, their faces bright with anticipation. "Grandma Evelyn!" Isabella had squealed, spinning around in her new party dress, a pink confection with ruffles that made her look like a little princess. "Look at all the decorations we put up for you. Mommy let us pick out the balloons and everything, and we made you a special banner." The house looked absolutely beautiful.
Natasha had transformed their formal living room and dining room into elegant party spaces with silver and blue decorations that matched the expensive flowers she'd ordered from Henry's. Round tables were set up in the living room, covered with crisp white linens and topped with centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath that must have cost a fortune. The dining room table had been cleared to make room for the catering setup, and I could see the professional warming trays and serving dishes already arranged and waiting. "Mom, you look absolutely fantastic," Christopher had said, giving me a hug that felt genuine and warm, the kind of embrace I remembered from his childhood. For a moment, looking at his face lit up with pleasure at seeing me dressed up and happy, he looked like the little boy I remembered, the one who used to help me bake cookies on Sunday afternoons and tell me about his dreams of becoming a famous artist someday. The catering van had pulled up right on schedule, and I'd watched through the bay window as uniformed workers unloaded trays and warming dishes and professional equipment, efficient people who moved with the practiced grace of those accustomed to serving high-end events. Natasha had certainly spared no expense, and I felt a flutter of excitement knowing that all my old friends would soon be arriving to enjoy food prepared by one of Hartford County's most prestigious catering companies. "Everything looks absolutely perfect," I'd told Natasha, squeezing her hand gratefully. "Thank you so much for organizing all of this. I can't remember the last time anyone went to such trouble for me." She'd smiled, but there was something in her expression I couldn't quite read. Something that didn't match the warmth of her words. "You deserve it, Mother Rosewood. After everything you've done for our family, this is the least we can do." I thought it was gratitude I was seeing in her eyes, maybe mixed with the stress of hosting such an elaborate event. Later, I would understand it had been something else entirely. That's when I decided to go to the kitchen to see if I could do anything to help with the final preparations before my guests arrived, and instead overheard the conversation that would shatter my understanding of my place in my family's family. The kitchen door was slightly ajar, and I'd been about to push it open and announce my presence when I heard Natasha's voice, sharp and irritated, speaking to someone I assumed was the catering manager. "Look, I need you to understand something about tonight's portion sizes." I paused, my hand on the door, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like an important conversation about the evening's service arrangements. And that's when I heard the words that would echo in my mind for weeks afterwards, words that would strip away every illusion I'd had about my family's love and respect. "Don't waste food on her. She barely eats anything anyway, and it's expensive."
The catering manager's voice was professional but confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't understand. This is a birthday party for the guest of honor, correct? Shouldn't we be ensuring she receives the best service and portions?" Natasha's response made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "Listen, the old woman is paying for this party herself, but that doesn't mean we need to go overboard. She picks at her food anyway. Give her smaller portions and focus the good stuff on the other guests. They'll actually appreciate it." The old woman? That's how my daughter-in-law referred to me when she thought I couldn't hear. Not Mother Rosewood, not Evelyn, not even Christopher's mother. Just the old woman. Like I was some burden they had to manage, rather than the person whose money was making their comfortable lifestyle possible. "Ma'am," the caterer said carefully, "we've prepared enough food for all guests according to your specifications. The portions will be consistent for everyone." "Fine," Natasha snapped, her cultured voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "And seat her at the back table, away from the main action, and don't fuss over her too much. She doesn't need special attention." I backed away from the door silently, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid someone might hear it. My hands were shaking as I made my way to the powder room, needing a moment to process what I'd just heard. In the mirror above the sink, I saw a 70-year-old woman in a new navy dress, her hair professionally styled, her face carefully made up for a celebration that was supposed to honor her. But the woman looking back at me seemed older, somehow, diminished, like someone who had just learned something terrible about herself. "Don't waste food on her." The words echoed in my mind as I tried to steady my breathing.
This was my birthday party, paid for with my money, held in honor of my 70 years of life, and my daughter-in-law was instructing the caterers to treat me like an afterthought, like someone not worth their best efforts. I thought about all the times over the past 3 years when I'd worried about being a burden. The nights I'd lean awake wondering if my Sunday visits were welcome or just tolerated. The moments when I'd caught Natasha glancing at her watch during our conversations, or when Christopher had seemed distracted when I called. I'd told myself I was being paranoid, that the loneliness since Theodore's death was making me imagine slights that weren't really there. But I hadn't been imagining anything. If this was how Natasha truly saw me when she thought I couldn't hear, then every smile, every Mother Rosewood, every warm gesture had been an act designed to keep the money flowing from my accounts into their household budget. I splashed cold water on my wrists, a trick Theodore had taught me years ago for calming down when I was upset. The cool water helped clear my head, but it couldn't wash away the hurt of what I'd discovered. I needed to get through this evening somehow, needed to smile and play the role of the grateful birthday woman, while my heart was breaking and my mind was reeling from this new understanding of my place in my family's life. When I returned to the living room, the first guests were beginning to arrive. Martha Henderson from church came through the front door carrying a beautifully wrapped present, her face bright with genuine pleasure at seeing me. "Evelyn, dear, you look absolutely radiant, 70 years young." Mrs. Patterson from next door followed close behind, along with 3 of my former colleagues from the elementary school library. These were people who had known me for decades, who remembered me as a vital, working woman with her own life and identity. Looking at their faces, seeing their genuine happiness at celebrating with me, I felt the sharp contrast with what I'd just overheard in the kitchen. "Evelyn," called out Dorothy Walsh, who had been the head librarian when I'd started working at the school 31 years ago. "This party is absolutely gorgeous. You must be so proud of your family for putting together such a beautiful celebration." I forced a smile, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. "Yes, it's lovely. Natasha worked very hard on the planning." More guests arrived over the next 30 minutes. Old neighbors, retired teachers, women from my bridge club, even Pastor Williams from St. Margaret's. The living room filled with warm chatter and laughter, people reconnecting and sharing stories about the good old days, when we'd all been younger and our lives had been fuller. For brief moments, I could almost forget what I'd heard in the kitchen and simply enjoy being surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me. But then, I'd catch sight of Natasha moving through the room, playing the perfect hostess, accepting compliments on the decorations and food with gracious smiles. "Oh, thank you so much. We just wanted to make sure Mother Rosewood felt special on her milestone birthday." The words sounded warm and loving, but now I could hear the performance in them, the calculated charm designed to maintain appearances. Christopher was working the room too, shaking hands with my male friends, chatting easily with the women who had known him since he was a child. "Mom deserves this and so much more," I heard him tell Pastor Williams. "She's been such a blessing to her family, especially since Dad passed away." The irony was suffocating. Here was my son speaking eloquently about what a blessing I was, while his wife was in the next room instructing caterers to not waste good food on me because I was just the old woman who picked at her meals.
Isabella and Sophia were dressed in their finest dresses, moving through the crowd of adults with practiced ease, accepting compliments on how much they'd grown and how beautiful they looked. They seemed comfortable in this world of adult conversation and formal entertaining, more comfortable than I felt in my own honor. "Grandma Evelyn," Isabella whispered, tugging on my dress, "when do we get to have cake? I helped Mommy pick it out, and it's really pretty." I leaned down to her level, grateful for a moment of genuine connection. "What kind of cake did you choose, sweetheart?" "Chocolate with vanilla frosting and real flowers on top. Mommy said it cost a lot of money, but you deserved the best because you're the best grandma in the world." Even my 9-year-old granddaughter knew this party was expensive. Even she understood that I was paying for my own celebration.
But in her innocent way, she thought it was because I deserved the best, not because I was being managed and manipulated by people who saw me as a source of funding rather than a person worthy of genuine respect and affection. The pianist began playing soft jazz standards in the corner of the living room, his skilled fingers moving across the keys with the kind of professional competence that commanded premium fees. The music was beautiful, creating an elegant atmosphere that made the gathering feel sophisticated and special. But every note reminded me of the $800 I'd paid for this man's services, money I'd been happy to spend when I thought it was contributing to a celebration planned with love. As the evening progressed, I found myself watching the interactions between family members and guests with new eyes. Natasha was the picture of the devoted daughter-in-law, constantly checking on my comfort, bringing me plates of food from the catering table, making sure I was introduced to guests I hadn't seen in years. But now I could see the performance in it, the way she was playing a role for the benefit of our audience. Mother Rosewood has been such an incredible support to our family, she told Dr. Peterson, who had been my physician for 15 years. We're so grateful for everything she's done for us, especially with the girls' education. She's made it possible for them to attend Sacred Heart Academy. Dr. Peterson nodded approvingly. That's wonderful, Evelyn. Those girls are lucky to have such a generous grandmother. I smiled and nodded, but inside I was screaming. Yes, I'd made their private school education possible. I'd also made their mortgage payments possible, their car payments possible, their vacation to Martha's Vineyard possible. I'd made their entire comfortable lifestyle possible, while apparently being seen as someone not worth wasting good food on. The catering staff began serving dinner around 7:30, and I watched carefully as they moved through the room with their trays. The portions they served to other guests were generous, beautifully presented, clearly the work of professionals who took pride in their craft. When they reached my table at the back of the room, exactly where Natasha had instructed them to seat me, I noticed the difference immediately. My plate held noticeably smaller portions than what I'd seen served to other guests. The salmon looked dried out, as if it had been sitting under the warming lights longer than the fresher pieces given to others. The vegetable medley was sparse, and the rice pilaf seemed to have been scraped from the bottom of the serving dish. It wasn't dramatically different, nothing that would be obvious to casual observers, but it was clear that the caterers had followed Natasha's instructions to economize on my meal. I ate slowly, tasting nothing, watching my friends and neighbors enjoy what was supposed to be my birthday celebration while trying to process the reality of my situation. These people had come here to honor me, had brought gifts and good wishes and genuine affection, but the family hosting this party saw me as someone not worth their best efforts, someone to be managed and manipulated even at my own celebration. Dorothy Walsh, sitting beside me, leaned over with concern. "Evelyn, dear, you're barely touching your food. Are you feeling all right?" "Just a little overwhelmed," I managed to say, which was true enough. It's been a long time since I've been to such a fancy party. She patted my hand warmly. "Well, you deserve every bit of this celebration. Christopher and Natasha have done such a beautiful job honoring you." If only she knew the truth. If only any of them knew that the woman being honored was apparently not worth the cost of a proper meal, even when she was paying for the entire event herself. As the evening continued, I became increasingly aware of the subtle ways I was being marginalized at my own party. When Pastor Williams wanted to make a toast, Christopher stepped forward to facilitate it, speaking eloquently about my contributions to the community and my role as a loving grandmother. But he positioned himself as the gracious host, accepting praise for organizing such a wonderful celebration, never mentioning that I had paid for everything. When Mrs. Patterson asked about the gorgeous flower arrangements, Natasha accepted the compliments with gracious humility. "I wanted everything to be perfect for Mother Rosewood's special day," she said, as if the expensive centerpieces had been her generous gift, rather than something purchased with my check. Even the pianist became part of the performance. During a brief break, he approached Christopher to discuss the music selection. "Your mother has excellent taste," he said. "The songs she requested are some of my favorites to perform." I hadn't requested any songs. I'd never even spoken to the pianist. But Christopher nodded as if he'd been intimately involved in curating the musical experience for my celebration.
The entire evening had become an elaborate theater production, with Christopher and Natasha as the generous, loving family members who had spared no expense to honor the family matriarch, while I sat at my back table eating dried-out salmon and watching the performance of my own life. The breaking point came during the cake ceremony. Natasha had made a point of mentioning to several guests how much the custom cake had cost, always followed by, "But Mother Rosewood deserved nothing but the best." When they wheeled out the chocolate masterpiece with its real flowers and professional decoration, everyone gasped with appreciation. It was indeed beautiful, worth every penny of the $200 I'd ultimately paid for it. But as I stood to blow out the candles, surrounded by friends singing happy birthday with genuine warmth and affection, I caught Natasha's eye across the room. She was smiling, but it was the smile of someone who was pleased with how well their performance was being received, rather than someone who was genuinely happy to celebrate my life. In that moment, standing before 70 candles representing 7 decades of life, surrounded by people who cared about me while being hosted by people who saw me as a convenient source of funding, I made a wish that would have surprised everyone in that room. I wished for the courage to stop pretending that this was love. After the last guest left around 10:30, I helped clean up, despite Natasha's protests that I shouldn't work at my own party. I needed something to do with my hands, some way to process what I'd learned about my family's true feelings while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. "Mom, you don't have to do that," Christopher said as I gathered empty plates from the tables. "You should be tired after such a big celebration." "I don't mind," I replied, though what I really wanted to say was that I was paying for this party, and cleaning up seemed like the least I could do, since apparently I wasn't even worth proper food portions. As I carried dishes to the kitchen, I could hear Natasha on the phone with someone, probably her sister Vivian, who lived in Boston. "The party went perfectly," she was saying. "Everyone was so impressed with how much we did for her. The flowers alone were gorgeous, and the catering was exactly what we needed to make the right impression." The right impression? Not to make me feel loved or valued, but to make the right impression on our community. My birthday party had been a social performance designed to showcase Christopher and Natasha as devoted family members, with me as the convenient prop who funded her own celebration. I finished loading the dishwasher in silence, my mind churning with questions I'd never thought to ask before. How long had they seen me this way? How many of our interactions over the past 3 years had been calculated performances designed to keep me generous and compliant? When Christopher called to ask about help with the girls' tuition, was he genuinely struggling, or was he simply maintaining the impression of financial need to keep my checks coming? "Mom," Christopher said, appearing in the kitchen doorway, "are you ready for me to drive you home? You look exhausted." I was exhausted, but not in the way he meant. I was exhausted from pretending not to have heard what I'd heard, from smiling and playing my role in their performance, from maintaining the illusion that this evening had been about love rather than social appearances funded by my checkbook. "Actually," I heard myself saying, "I think I'd like to stay overnight if that's all right. I'm feeling a bit tired to drive, and it would give me more time with the girls in the morning." Christopher looked surprised but pleased. "Of course, Mom. You know you're always welcome here. I'll get the guest room ready for you." What I really wanted was time to think, to process what I'd learned, to figure out what this discovery meant for my relationship with my son's family. And I wanted to observe them when they thought I wasn't paying attention, to see if there were other signs I'd been missing, other indications that my role in their lives was very different from what I'd believed. The guest room was on the 2nd floor, decorated in the same expensive style as the rest of the house. The furniture was from Ethan Allen, the bedding was high-quality cotton with a thread count that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Everything in this house spoke of comfort and affluence that my monthly checks made possible. I lay in the guest bed, still wearing my new navy dress because I couldn't bring myself to change into the nightgown I'd packed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Christopher and Natasha getting ready for bed down the hall.
Their voices were muffled, but occasionally I could make out fragments of conversation. Went well, looked impressed, covered everything. They were probably discussing the party, evaluating how successfully they'd managed the evening's performance. I wondered if they were congratulating themselves on how well they'd handled their generous but apparently burdensome mother-in-law, how skillfully they'd maintained the illusion of grateful family devotion while cutting corners on my meal. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Natasha's voice. Don't waste food on her. The casual cruelty of it, the matter-of-fact way she dismissed my worth as a human being worthy of proper treatment. And the fact that she'd said it at my own birthday party, funded with my own money, surrounded by my own friends who had come to celebrate my life.
But what haunted me even more was the realization that this probably wasn't an isolated incident. If Natasha felt comfortable speaking about me this way to strangers, if she felt secure enough in her position to openly instruct service providers to treat me as a second-class citizen, then this attitude had been developing for some time. How many other conversations had there been that I hadn't overheard? How many other ways had I been diminished and devalued while continuing to fund the very lifestyle that made such treatment possible? Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Light footsteps, probably one of the girls getting up to use the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard a soft knock. "Grandma Evelyn?" It was Isabella's voice, whisper quiet. "Are you awake?" I got up and opened the door to find my youngest granddaughter standing in the hallway in her princess pajamas, holding her favorite stuffed elephant. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Can't sleep?" "I had a bad dream," she said, rubbing her eyes. "Can I sit with you for a minute?" I opened the door wider, and she padded into the guest room, climbing onto the bed and curling up beside me, just like she used to do when she was smaller. For a moment, the hurt and confusion of the evening faded, replaced by the simple joy of comforting my granddaughter. "Want to tell me about your dream?" I asked, stroking her hair. "It was about you going away," she said in a small voice. "In the dream, you moved far away and we couldn't see you anymore. It made me really sad." My throat tightened. "Oh, sweetheart, that was just a dream. I'm not going anywhere." "Promise?" "I promise," I said, though the words felt strange in my mouth. How could I promise that when I was beginning to understand that my relationship with her parents was built on a foundation that was far more fragile than I'd realized? "Grandma Evelyn," Isabella said sleepily, "why did Mommy tell the food people not to give you very much dinner tonight? I saw her talking to them and she looked angry." My heart stopped. Even the children had noticed. "What did you hear, sweetheart?" "She said something about not wasting food, but it was your birthday party. You should get the most food because it's your special day." Out of the mouths of babes, my 9-year-old granddaughter understood something that the adults in this house had apparently forgotten, that the person being honored at a celebration should be treated with special care and attention, not managed like an expensive inconvenience. "Sometimes adults say things they don't really mean when they're stressed about party planning," I told her, hating myself for lying, but not wanting to burden a child with the ugliness I'd discovered. "But you paid for the party, right? Daddy told Sophia that you wrote a check for all the food and flowers and music." Even the children knew I was funding my own celebration. There were no secrets in this house, apparently, except from me about how I was really perceived by the people I'd been supporting. I held Isabella until she fell back asleep, then carried her to her own room and tucked her into her princess-themed bed. Looking at her peaceful face in the soft glow of her nightlight, I felt a fierce protective love that reminded me why I'd been so willing to support this family financially. Whatever was happening between Christopher, Natasha, and me, Isabella and Sophia were innocent. They were children who loved their grandmother and deserved to feel secure and cared for. But they also deserved to grow up in a family where people treated each other with basic human dignity, where elderly relatives weren't dismissed as burdens not worth proper consideration. What kind of lessons were they learning from watching their mother treat me like an expensive inconvenience? I made my way back to the guest room, but sleep remained elusive. My mind kept circling back to the financial support I'd been providing and the way it had been received. I thought I was helping a struggling young family maintain their standard of living during a difficult period. But what if that wasn't the reality at all? What if Christopher and Natasha had come to see my support not as temporary assistance during hard times, but as an entitlement? What if they'd structured their lifestyle around my contributions, making financial decisions based on the assumption that Mom's money would always be there to cover the shortfall? I thought about the private school tuition I paid each semester, $8,000 per child per year. Had they researched public school options, or had they simply enrolled the girls at Sacred Heart Academy knowing that I would cover the cost? The vacation to Martha's Vineyard that I'd funded last summer, had that been a necessary family bonding experience, or had it been a luxury they'd felt entitled to enjoy at my expense? The mortgage payments troubled me most of all. When Christopher had first asked for help with the house payments, he'd presented it as a temporary solution. Just until I can find a better position or Natasha can go back to work, he'd said. We hate to ask, but we don't want to lose the house.
But 3 years later, my monthly checks were still keeping them in their West Hartford colonial, and there had been no mention of timeline for when they might be able to resume full financial responsibility for their own housing. Had they been actively working toward financial independence, or had they simply accepted that Mom would handle the mortgage indefinitely? And what about the subtle pressure I'd been feeling lately to increase my contributions? Just last month, Natasha had mentioned that the girls were getting older and their expenses were increasing. Private school tuition goes up every year, and Sophia wants to add piano lessons to her violin studies. Isabella is showing real talent in gymnastics, and the competitive program costs quite a bit more than recreational classes. I'd written larger checks without question, happy to support my granddaughter's development and education. But now I wondered if these weren't legitimate educational expenses so much as lifestyle inflation funded by someone they'd come to see as a reliable financial resource rather than a family member deserving of basic respect. The house was completely quiet now, everyone asleep except for me. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured neighborhood where every house cost more than most people made in several years. Streetlights illuminated sidewalks free of litter, driveways filled with luxury cars, lawns maintained by professional landscaping services. This was the world my money had helped Christopher and Natasha maintain, a world where appearances mattered more than authenticity, where social status was more important than family loyalty. Standing there in my expensive new dress in a guest room that I'd indirectly helped furnish through my financial support, I felt the full weight of my situation settling over me like a heavy blanket. I wasn't a beloved family matriarch being honored by grateful relatives. I was a convenient source of funding being managed by people who saw me as an obligation rather than a blessing, someone whose money was welcome but whose actual presence was something to be minimized and controlled. The question that kept me awake until dawn was simple but devastating. If this was how they really saw me, what else didn't I know about my place in their lives? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? Because one thing had become crystal clear during those long, sleepless hours in their guest room, I was 70 years old, I was alone, and I'd been allowing myself to be treated as a second-class citizen in my own family. But I wasn't helpless, and I wasn't powerless. I had choices to make about how the rest of my life would unfold, and I was beginning to think those choices needed to be very different from the ones I'd been making for the past 3 years. The sun was just beginning to rise over West Hartford when I finally drifted off to sleep, and my last conscious thought was about the checkbook sitting in my purse downstairs and all the ways that checkbook had been shaping my relationships without me fully understanding the dynamics at play. Tomorrow, I would start asking different questions and demanding different answers. Tomorrow, I would begin to understand exactly what I'd been funding and why. And tomorrow, I would start making decisions based on what I'd learned rather than what I'd hoped was true. The old woman who had paid for her own birthday party while being told she wasn't worth proper food portions was about to become someone else entirely. Someone who understood her own value and insisted that others recognize it too. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching the heaviness I felt in my chest as I made my way downstairs to the kitchen. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of fitful sleep, my mind churning with questions and realizations that refused to let me rest.
The house was quiet, everyone else still sleeping off the previous evening's celebration. I made coffee using the expensive machine that Christopher and Natasha had bought with money I'd given them for kitchen upgrades 6 months ago. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I looked around their kitchen with new eyes. The granite countertops, the professional-grade appliances, the custom cabinetry that Natasha had insisted they needed for proper entertaining. How much of this beautiful space had been funded by my contributions? The coffee maker beeped softly, and I poured myself a cup, adding cream from a container that probably cost more than I spent on groceries for a week. Everything in this house spoke of careful attention to quality and appearance, no expense spared to maintain the image of success and affluence that West Hartford society expected. I was sitting at their kitchen island watching the rain streak down the windows when Natasha appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my entire outfit from the previous evening, her blonde hair perfectly tousled in that effortless way that actually required considerable effort to achieve. "Mother Rosewood," she said with surprise, "you're up early. How did you sleep?" "Fine," I lied, not trusting myself to say more. The woman standing before me looked exactly the same as she had yesterday, but everything about how I saw her had changed. This was the person who had instructed caterers not to waste food on me at my own birthday party.
She moved to the coffee maker, pouring herself a cup with the practiced grace of someone who had never had to worry about whether she deserved good coffee or if someone might think she was wasting expensive beans. "I hope the guest room was comfortable. Christopher was so pleased that you decided to stay over." "It was lovely, thank you." I watched her add a splash of expensive vanilla creamer to her coffee, the kind that cost 3 times as much as regular cream, but was apparently worth it for the enhanced flavor experience. I wondered if she'd ever suggested I not waste the good creamer on myself. "Last night was such a success," Natasha continued, settling onto the stool beside me at the kitchen island. "Everyone seemed to have such a wonderful time. Mrs. Patterson told me it was the best party she'd been to in years." I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee and trying to reconcile this warm, chatty woman with the person I'd heard speaking so dismissively about me to the caterers. The food was beautiful. Prestige Catering certainly lived up to their reputation. "Oh, absolutely. Though between you and me," Natasha lowered her voice conspiratorially, "they were quite expensive. But we wanted everything to be perfect for your special day." The casual way she mentioned the expense, as if she'd been the one paying for it, made my stomach clench. I had written the check for $3,500 to cover the catering, flowers, and entertainment. She knew this because she'd given me the invoice totals herself. But she was speaking as if she and Christopher had made a financial sacrifice for my benefit. "I was happy to cover those costs," I said carefully. "It seemed only right, since it was my celebration." "You're so generous, Mother Rosewood. We're lucky to have you." The words sounded warm and grateful, but after what I'd overheard, I could hear the calculation beneath them. I was generous, which made them lucky. Not beloved, not cherished, not valued for who I was as a person. Lucky to have access to my checkbook. Christopher appeared in the kitchen a few minutes later, dressed in weekend clothes, but somehow still managing to look polished and successful. "Mom, you're up early. How are you feeling after your big night?" "Good," I said, though I felt anything but good. "It was a lovely party. Thank you both for organizing it." "We were happy to do it," he said, kissing my cheek as he passed by to get his own coffee. "You deserve to be celebrated." The word deserve hit me oddly. I deserved to be celebrated, but apparently I didn't deserve proper food portions at my own party. I deserved a beautiful gathering, funded by my own money, but I didn't deserve to be seated prominently or treated as the true guest of honor. Over the next hour, as we shared breakfast and talked about the previous evening, I found myself listening to Christopher and Natasha's conversation with new awareness. They discussed the party as if they had been the generous hosts rather than the facilitators of an event I had paid for. They accepted praise for the beautiful flowers as if they hadn't been purchased with my check. They talked about the investment in creating such a memorable celebration as if the money had come from their own accounts.
But most troubling was the way they discussed the guests, particularly my old friends from the library and church. There was a subtle undertone of condescension in their comments, a sense that these people were somehow below their current social status. Mrs. Patterson seemed impressed with the house. I don't think she's ever been to a catered event before. The library ladies were definitely out of their element, Christopher added with a chuckle. Did you see how Dorothy Walsh was photographing everything with her phone, like she'd never seen professional flower arrangements before? I felt a stab of defensive anger. Dorothy Walsh had been my supervisor for 15 years, a woman of intelligence and dignity who had dedicated her career to education and community service. Mrs. Patterson had been my neighbor for over a decade, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand when Theodore was ill. These were good people, people who cared about me genuinely, and Christopher and Natasha were discussing them like curiosities from a lower social class. They're lovely people, I said quietly, some of my oldest and dearest friends. Of course they are, Natasha said quickly, but I caught the look she exchanged with Christopher, a look that suggested they were humoring me, allowing me my sentimental attachments to people they considered provincial and unsophisticated. When had this happened? When had my son become someone who looked down on the people and values that had shaped his upbringing? I'd raised him to respect others regardless of their financial status, to value character over wealth, to understand that true worth had nothing to do with the size of someone's bank account or the prestige of their address. But looking at him now, in his expensive weekend clothes, in his expensive kitchen, I could see that those lessons hadn't survived his marriage to Natasha and their integration into West Hartford society. He'd learned new values, values that placed appearance and social status above family loyalty and basic human decency. The girls came downstairs around 9 o'clock, still in their pajamas, rubbing sleep from their eyes, and immediately gravitating toward me for good morning hugs. Isabella climbed onto my lap, while Sophia leaned against my shoulder, and for a moment the kitchen felt warm and loving, the way family kitchens should feel. "Did you have fun at your party, Grandma Evelyn? You looked really pretty in your new dress."
I had a wonderful time, sweetheart. Thank you for helping with the decorations. Everything looked beautiful. Mommy said we spent a lot of money to make it special for you, Isabella chimed in. She said the food cost as much as our groceries for a whole month. I felt Christopher and Natasha's eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd respond to this innocent revelation. It was worth every penny to see all my friends and celebrate with the people I love, I said carefully. But Isabella wasn't finished. Daddy said you wrote a check for everything because you wanted to make sure we could afford it. He said you're the most generous grandma in the world. The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain pattering against the windows. Even the children understood the financial dynamics at play, understood that their grandmother was funding her own celebration. But they spoke about it with the innocence of children, who believed this was an act of love, rather than evidence of a transaction disguised as family devotion. Your grandmother is very generous, Natasha said smoothly, stroking Isabella's hair. We're all very grateful for everything she does for our family. Grateful. There was that word again. Not loved, not cherished, not honored. Grateful. The way you might be grateful for a business partner or a benefactor, someone whose contributions you appreciate, but who exists primarily to serve your needs, rather than to be valued for their own intrinsic worth. After breakfast, I announced that I needed to head home to take care of some errands before the weekend was over. The truth was that I needed space to think, needed time away from their performance of family affection to process what I'd learned and figure out what it meant for my future. "Are you sure you can't stay longer?" Christopher asked, but his tone was polite rather than pressing. "The girls love having you here." "I need to get home," I said, gathering my purse and the leftover birthday cake they'd insisted I take with me. "But thank you again for such a beautiful party." As I drove home through the gray September morning, my mind kept returning to the conversation I'd overheard and the way it reframed everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Christopher's family. Don't waste food on her. The casual cruelty of it, the matter-of-fact dismissal of my worth as a human being deserving of proper treatment. But it wasn't just the words themselves that haunted me. It was what they revealed about how Natasha truly saw me when she thought no one was listening. If she felt comfortable instructing caterers to economize on my meal at my own birthday party, what did that say about how she discussed me in other contexts? How did she describe me to her friends, her family, her social circle? More troubling still was Christopher's complicity. He had to have known about the seating arrangement that placed me at the back of the room. He had to have noticed that I was being treated differently from the other guests. Yet he'd said nothing, done nothing to ensure I was properly honored at my own celebration. My house on Maple Avenue looked smaller and shabbier than usual as I pulled into the driveway. The contrast with Christopher and Natasha's elegant colonial was stark, a reminder of the different worlds we inhabited, despite being family. But as I unlocked my front door and stepped into the familiar quiet of my own space, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Here, in this modest house with its worn furniture and faded wallpaper, I wasn't performing for anyone. I wasn't being managed or manipulated or carefully handled to maintain someone else's financial advantage. I was simply Evelyn Rosewood, a 70-year-old widow with her own thoughts and feelings and dignity intact. I made fresh coffee in my own kitchen, using the same blue ceramic mug I'd used for 20 years, and sat at my small table to think. The birthday cake sat on the counter, still in its expensive bakery box, a symbol of the celebration that had been orchestrated around me rather than for me. The phone rang around noon, startling me out of my brooding. The caller ID showed Christopher's number. "Mom, I just wanted to make sure you got home safely." His voice was warm and concerned. "The roads looked slick this morning." "I'm fine, Christopher. Thank you for checking." "Listen, Natasha and I were talking, and we realized we never properly thanked you for covering the party expenses. It was incredibly generous of you, and we want you to know how much it meant to us to be able to give you such a special celebration." There it was again. They were thanking me for paying for my own party, while simultaneously taking credit for giving me a special celebration. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. "You organized everything beautifully," I said, testing the waters. "I hope it wasn't too much trouble." "Not at all. We loved doing it for you. Actually, that's why I'm calling. Natasha had an idea about making this an annual tradition. She thinks we should throw you a party every year, maybe invite more people next time, really make it an event that people talk about." An annual tradition, funded by my money, but organized and hosted by them, allowing them to play the role of devoted family members, while I played the role of grateful recipient of their generosity. The pattern was becoming clear.
"That's very thoughtful," I said carefully. "But let's see how this year's celebration settles in my memory before we start planning next year's." After I hung up, I found myself wandering through my house, looking at the photographs that covered nearly every surface. Pictures of Christopher, various ages, school photos and graduation pictures and wedding portraits, images of Theodore and me on vacations, at family gatherings, celebrating holidays and anniversaries, pictures of Isabella and Sophia from birth through their current ages, documenting their growth and achievements. These photographs told the story of a life built around family relationships, around love and support and shared experiences. But as I looked at them now, I wondered how many of the recent images had been performance pieces rather than genuine moments of connection. The wedding photo from Christopher and Natasha's ceremony 5 years ago showed all of us beaming with happiness. But I remembered now how Natasha had insisted on the most expensive photographer in Hartford County, how she'd chosen the most elaborate venue despite Christopher's concerns about cost. Even then, I'd helped cover some of the expenses because I wanted their special day to be perfect. Had that been the beginning of this pattern? Had Natasha identified me early as someone who could be relied upon to fund lifestyle choices that exceeded their actual means? Had she been cultivating my generosity from the very beginning of her marriage to my son? I thought about all the conversations we'd had over the years about money and expenses. Natasha had always been skilled at presenting their financial needs in ways that made my help seem essential and time-sensitive. The tuition payment is due next week, and Christopher's commission check won't come through until the end of the month. The car inspection revealed some safety issues that need to be addressed immediately. The girls' summer camp registration deadline is tomorrow, and we just don't have the funds available right now. There was always urgency, always a deadline that made careful consideration impossible, always a crisis that required immediate financial intervention from someone who cared about the family's well-being. And I'd responded every time, writing checks to solve problems that might not have been as urgent or unavoidable as they seemed. But the most disturbing realization was how skillfully they'd managed my emotions around these requests. They never asked directly for money. Instead, they'd share their concerns and stress, allowing me to offer solutions that made me feel helpful and needed rather than used. "Oh, Mother Rosewood, you don't need to do that," Natasha would say when I offered to help. "We'll figure something out." But her relief when I insisted on contributing was always obvious and immediate. I thought I was being generous. I thought I was helping my family during a difficult period, using my resources to ensure that my granddaughters had opportunities and that Christopher and Natasha could maintain their standard of living while working toward financial stability. But what if financial stability had never been their goal? What if they'd discovered that managing my generosity was easier than achieving true independence? What if the struggling family I'd been supporting was actually a carefully maintained illusion designed to keep my checks coming? The phone rang again around 2 in the afternoon. This time, it was Natasha. "Mother Rosewood, I hope you're resting after such a wonderful evening. I wanted to call and tell you how much your generosity meant to everyone who attended. People are still talking about what a beautiful celebration it was. I'm glad everyone enjoyed themselves, though the conversation felt like navigating a minefield now that I understood what lay beneath her gracious words. Actually, I'm calling because I have some exciting news. Do you remember me mentioning that Isabella has been showing real talent in gymnastics?" My heart sank. Here it came, another opportunity for me to demonstrate my generosity, another chance for them to benefit from my willingness to fund their lifestyle choices. "Yes, I remember you mentioning that she enjoyed her classes. Well, her coach approached us yesterday after the party. She thinks Isabella has real potential for competitive gymnastics, but it would mean switching to a different program. Elite Gymnastics Academy in Farmington has an opening in their developmental team, but it's quite a bit more expensive than her current recreational classes." I waited, knowing what was coming next. The thing is, the enrollment deadline is next week, and we need to put down a deposit to hold her spot. It's $2,500 just for the first semester, and then there are additional costs for uniforms and equipment and travel to competitions. 24 hours after my birthday party, less than a day after discovering how little I apparently meant to them as a person, they were already planning their next request for money. The timing was breathtaking in its audacity. "That's quite expensive," I said carefully. "It is, but this could be such an incredible opportunity for Isabella. The coach says she has natural ability, and early training is so important for developing proper technique. We just hate the idea of having to tell her no because of money." There it was, the emotional manipulation wrapped in concern for my granddaughter's development. They weren't asking me to fund an expensive hobby. They were asking me to ensure that Isabella didn't miss out on her potential because her parents couldn't afford to nurture her talents.
Have you and Christopher discussed how you'll handle the ongoing costs if this leads to more advanced training? I asked. There was a pause. Well, we're hoping that Christopher's career situation will improve over the next year. And if Isabella shows real promise, there might be scholarship opportunities down the line. In other words, they had no plan for funding this expensive commitment beyond continuing to rely on my financial support. They were asking me to not just cover the initial costs, but to implicitly commit to funding Isabella's gymnastics career for years to come. "I'll need to think about it," I said, though what I really needed was time to understand whether this request was about Isabella's genuine talent and interests or about Natasha's desire to maintain their image as parents who could afford elite opportunities for their children.
Of course, take your time, though the enrollment deadline is Thursday, so we can't wait too long to make a decision. Another deadline, another time-sensitive crisis that required immediate financial intervention. The pattern was so clear now that I wondered how I'd missed it before. After we hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the photographs of Isabella and Sophia, trying to separate my love for them from my growing understanding of how that love was being manipulated. I wanted to support their education and development, wanted them to have opportunities that Christopher and I had worked so hard to provide. But I was beginning to understand that there was a difference between supporting my granddaughters and enabling their parents' financial irresponsibility. If Christopher and Natasha had come to see my contributions as an entitlement rather than emergency assistance, then my generosity wasn't helping them achieve independence. It was making independence unnecessary. Monday morning brought another revelation. I was sorting through my mail when I found a statement from my investment account, one that I usually glanced at quickly before filing away. But this time, seeing the balance reminded me of conversations I'd had with my financial advisor about maintaining my nest egg for long-term care needs. Eleanor Winters had been managing my investments since Theodore's death, and she'd always been conservative about withdrawals, mindful that I might need significant funds for medical care or assisted living arrangements as I aged. But over the past 3 years, my regular contributions to Christopher's family had been eating into my principal in ways that concerned her. "Mrs. Rosewood," she'd said during our last meeting, "I want to make sure you're thinking long-term about these family contributions. At your current rate of giving, you'll have significantly depleted your resources within the next 5 to 7 years. I'd brushed off her concerns at the time, confident that Christopher's situation would improve and that my support was temporary. But what if it wasn't temporary? What if this had become the permanent financial structure of our family relationship? I called Eleanor's office and scheduled an appointment for later that week. It was time to get a clear picture of my financial situation and understand exactly what my generosity was costing me in terms of my own security and independence. But first, I needed to understand something else. I needed to know if the pattern I'd glimpsed at my birthday party extended to other areas of how I was treated by Christopher's family. That afternoon, I drove to Sacred Heart Academy to pick up Isabella and Sophia, something I did occasionally when Christopher and Natasha had scheduling conflicts. I arrived a few minutes early and waited in the carpool line, watching the stream of expensive cars and well-dressed parents that characterized this exclusive school environment. When the girls climbed into my aging Toyota Camry, I could see them glancing around at the luxury vehicles surrounding us. A Mercedes pulled up beside us, and I watched Sophia's face as she observed the other family with obvious longing. "Grandma Evelyn," Sophia said as we pulled away from the school, "why don't you drive a nicer car? All the other grandparents have new cars." The question hit me harder than it should have. "This car works perfectly well, sweetheart. It gets me where I need to go safely." "But it's old," Isabella chimed in from the back seat. "Jenny Morrison's grandmother drives a BMW, and it has heated seats and a sunroof and everything." I looked at my granddaughters in the rearview mirror, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. These children had been raised in an environment where worth was measured by external symbols of wealth, where having an older car or modest house was something to be embarrassed about rather than practical choices made by people with different priorities. "Do you think less of me because I don't drive an expensive car?" "No," they both protested immediately, and their responses seemed genuine. But I could see the confusion in their eyes, the difficulty they had reconciling their love for me with the social values they'd absorbed from their parents and their school environment. "It's just that everyone else's grandparents have nice things," Sophia explained, "and Mommy always talks about how important it is to make a good impression." Making a good impression. That seemed to be the driving force behind so many of Christopher and Natasha's decisions, the lens through which they viewed everything from school choice to social events to family relationships. I was useful for funding the lifestyle that made good impressions possible,
but my own modest circumstances were apparently something to be managed and minimized rather than accepted as the reality of who I was.
That evening, I called my old friend Margaret Kellerman, who had been the school principal during my final years at Millbrook Elementary. We'd maintained a friendship since my retirement, and she'd been one of the guests at my birthday party. "Evelyn, I've been thinking about your party all weekend," she said warmly. "It was absolutely lovely. Your family clearly adores you." "Thank you, Margaret. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Though I have to ask, and forgive me if this is presumptuous, but did you pay for that party yourself?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. "What makes you ask that?" "Just some things I observed. The way Christopher and Natasha talked about the expenses, the way they seemed more focused on impressing the guests than on actually celebrating you. And honestly, Evelyn, I know what Christopher makes at his current job, and that party cost more than most people spend on their children's weddings." Margaret had always been perceptive, skilled at reading between the lines of social situations. It shouldn't have surprised me that she'd seen through the performance. "I contributed to the costs," I admitted. "I wanted it to be special." "Oh, honey," her voice was full of gentle concern. "You paid for your own birthday party while they took credit for throwing it for you?" Hearing it stated so plainly made the reality of the situation impossible to deny. "It's complicated, Margaret." "Is it?" Because from where I was sitting, it looked like a lovely family taking advantage of a generous woman's desire to feel valued and included. That night, lying in my own bed in my own house, I finally allowed myself to fully process what Margaret had observed and what I'd been trying not to acknowledge. My son and daughter-in-law had orchestrated an elaborate celebration that made them look like devoted family members while positioning me as the grateful recipient of their generosity. They'd accepted praise for their thoughtfulness while I funded the entire event. They'd seated me in the back, instructed caterers not to waste good food on me, and then basked in the glow of community approval for how well they treated their aging mother. It was manipulation so sophisticated that I'd been an active participant in my own diminishment, writing checks to fund a performance designed to maintain the illusion of family devotion, while the reality was far more transactional. But the most devastating realization was that this probably wasn't new. If they were comfortable treating me this way at such a public event, surrounded by people who knew us all, then this dynamic had been developing for some time. How many other interactions had been carefully orchestrated to maintain their image while minimizing their actual investment in my well-being? I thought about the Sunday dinners I'd treasured, the family gatherings I'd looked forward to all week. Had those been genuine expressions of family love, or had they been the minimum investment required to maintain access to my financial support? As I finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of Tuesday morning, I knew that everything had changed. I couldn't go back to the naive assumption that my family valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. And I couldn't continue funding a lifestyle for people who saw me as a convenient resource rather than a beloved family member. Tomorrow, I would start asking harder questions and demanding honest answers. Tomorrow, I would begin to understand exactly what my money had been buying and whether the price I'd been paying was worth what I'd been receiving in return. The old woman who had funded her own humiliation was about to become someone else entirely, someone who understood the difference between love and financial management, between family devotion and skilled manipulation. Someone who was no longer willing to pay for the privilege of being treated as less than she was worth. 3 months after my devastating birthday party, I was sitting in my newly renovated kitchen reviewing applications for the volunteer coordinator position at Millbrook Community Center. The kitchen looked completely different now. Fresh paint, new appliances I'd bought for myself, and a small dining table where I could eat my meals with dignity instead of wondering if someone thought I was wasting good food. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken weeks of careful planning, difficult conversations, and the kind of courage I didn't know I possessed at 70 years old. But the woman who had once allowed herself to be treated as a second-class citizen at her own birthday party was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and insisted that others recognize it too. Let me tell you how it all unfolded.
The Wednesday after my birthday party, I'd made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to fund Christopher and Natasha's lifestyle while being treated like an inconvenience, I decided to investigate exactly what my money had been supporting and whether my family's financial struggles were as real as they claimed. My first stop was Eleanor Winter's investment office, where the numbers told a stark story. In 3 years of helping my family, I'd withdrawn $127,000 from my retirement accounts. Not the $90,000 I'd estimated, but nearly $130,000 when I included all the small emergency requests, vacation funds, and special opportunities for the girls. Mrs. Rosewood, Eleanor had said, her voice gentle but firm, "You've depleted 45% of your retirement savings. At this rate, you'll face serious financial hardship within 5 years if you need long-term care or encounter major medical expenses."
The reality was sobering. I'd been so focused on helping my family that I'd jeopardized my own security. But what Eleanor showed me next was even more disturbing. "I took the liberty of researching property values in your son's neighborhood," she said, sliding a report across her desk. "His home has appreciated by $180,000 since he purchased it. Combined with the mortgage payments you've been covering, he's built substantial equity while you've depleted your assets." Christopher was getting richer while I was getting poorer, and my money was making it possible. But the real investigation began when I hired Marcus Webb, a private investigator recommended by Eleanor's firm. I felt guilty about investigating my own family, but I needed to understand what my money was really funding and whether their claims of financial hardship were legitimate. What Marcus discovered over the next 2 weeks shattered every assumption I'd made about Christopher and Natasha's circumstances. Christopher's salary at his new advertising firm was actually higher than what he'd been making at his previous job. The demotion he'd described had actually been a lateral move to a smaller company where he'd negotiated better compensation and more flexible hours. He wasn't struggling financially. He was thriving. Natasha hadn't been unable to return to work because of childcare needs. She'd been offered her old position back at the dental practice 18 months ago, but had turned it down because, as she'd told her former colleague, "Christopher's mother helps out enough that I don't really need to work right now." The private school tuition I'd been paying wasn't the result of Natasha's high standards for education. Sacred Heart Academy had offered both girls need-based financial aid that would have covered 60% of their tuition costs. Christopher and Natasha had declined the aid because accepting it would have required financial disclosure that might have affected their membership in the country club and their standing in West Hartford society. Most damaging of all, the mortgage help I'd been providing wasn't preventing them from losing their home. Their income was sufficient to cover the mortgage payments. My contributions were being used to maintain a lifestyle that included country club memberships, expensive vacations, luxury car payments, and the kind of discretionary spending that their actual income couldn't support. I'd been funding their social ambitions, not their survival needs. But Marcus had uncovered something else that made my blood boil with rage. Through his contacts in the catering industry, he'd learned about the specific instructions Natasha had given to Prestige Catering for my birthday party. She hadn't just told them not to waste food on me. She'd negotiated a reduced rate for my meals specifically, saving herself $50 on the total catering bill by ensuring that the guest of honor received cheaper, lower-quality portions than the other attendees. At my own birthday party, funded with my own money, she'd found a way to save money by skimping on my dinner. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Isabella's gymnastics coach at her current recreational program called me directly, having gotten my number from the school directory. "Mrs. Rosewood, I understand that Isabella might be switching to Elite Gymnastics Academy, and I wanted to speak with you about that decision." Oh, I was surprised that she was calling me rather than Christopher or Natasha. "Mrs. Morrison mentioned that you were the one making the financial decisions about Isabella's athletics. I wanted you to know that while elite gymnastics is certainly prestigious, Isabella isn't showing the kind of exceptional talent that would justify their intensive program." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" "Isabella is a lovely child, and she enjoys gymnastics,
but she's not demonstrating the natural ability or competitive drive that would make Elite's program worthwhile. She's perfectly suited for recreational gymnastics, but asking her to compete at that level would likely lead to frustration and burnout. Did you share this assessment with her parents? I tried to, but Mrs. Morrison seemed more interested in the prestige of the Elite program than in what would actually be best for Isabella. She mentioned several times that other families from Sacred Heart Academy had children in Elite's program. So the gymnastics opportunity wasn't about Isabella's talent or potential. It was about Natasha's desire to maintain their social status among the other private school families, funded by my retirement savings. Armed with all this information, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to confront Christopher and Natasha with the truth about what I'd discovered, and I was going to do it in a way that ensured they couldn't continue their manipulation. I invited them to dinner at my house the following Sunday, telling them I had some important family matters to discuss. I hired Maria Santos, a caterer who specialized in small, intimate dinners, and asked her to prepare an elegant meal for 4 adults and 2 children. But here's where I added my own twist to the evening.
When Maria arrived to set up, I gave her specific instructions that mirrored what Natasha had done to me. When you serve my son and daughter-in-law, I told her, please give them smaller portions than what you serve me and the girls. Tell them that I requested this because I don't want to waste expensive food on people who might not appreciate it properly. Maria looked confused, but she was being paid well and agreed to follow my instructions. Christopher and Natasha arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, dressed in their usual expensive casual wear, the girls excited to be having dinner at Grandma Evelyn's house. I'd set my small dining room table with my finest china, the set Theodore and I had received as a wedding gift, but rarely used. "Mom, this looks beautiful," Christopher said, helping Isabella into her chair. "You didn't need to go to such trouble." "No trouble at all," I replied. "Family deserves the best." Maria began serving the first course, a beautiful butternut squash soup with fresh herbs. When she reached Christopher and Natasha, she followed my instructions exactly. "I'm sorry," she said to Natasha, ladling a noticeably smaller portion into her bowl, "but Mrs. Rosewood requested that I serve you and your husband smaller portions. She mentioned something about not wanting to waste expensive food on people who might not fully appreciate it." The silence that followed was deafening. Natasha's face went white, then red, then white again. Christopher stared at me in shock and dawning understanding. "Mom, what's going on here?" "I'm treating you exactly the way you treated me at my birthday party," I said calmly, taking a spoonful of my full-sized soup portion. "I thought you might like to experience what it feels like to be considered not worth proper food portions at a family dinner." "That's not what happened at your party," Natasha said, but her voice was shaky. "Isn't it? Because I have a witness who heard you instruct Prestige Catering not to waste food on me because I barely eat anything and it's expensive." The girls were looking between the adults with confusion and growing concern. "Grandma Evelyn, why is everyone acting weird?" "Because sometimes adults need to have important conversations about how we treat each other. And sometimes those conversations are uncomfortable, but necessary." Maria served the main course, again following my instructions to give Christopher and Natasha smaller, less attractive portions, while serving me and the girls generous helpings of the beautifully prepared salmon and roasted vegetables. "This is ridiculous," Natasha said, pushing her plate away. "What's your point, Mother Rosewood?" "My point is that I've discovered some interesting things about how my financial support has been used and how my generosity has been managed." I reached for the folder I'd prepared, filled with Marcus's investigation results, financial statements, and documentation of their deception. For instance, I learned that Christopher's current salary is actually higher than his previous job, not lower as you've both claimed. I learned that Natasha declined to return to work not because of childcare needs,
but because my financial support made employment unnecessary. Christopher had gone pale. Mom, if you've been investigating us, I learned that you declined financial aid at Sacred Heart Academy because accepting it would require disclosure that might affect your country club membership. I learned that your mortgage payments could be managed with your actual income, but my contributions allow you to maintain a lifestyle beyond your means. You hired a private investigator? Natasha's voice was shrill with outrage. You spied on your own family? I protected myself from being financially abused, which is what's been happening for 3 years. Maria served dessert, continuing to follow my instructions about portion sizes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Here they were, experiencing exactly what they'd put me through, while I calmly explained how thoroughly I'd researched their deception. But the most interesting discovery was learning about the specific instructions you gave to the caterers at my birthday party. Not only did you tell them not to waste food on me, but you negotiated a reduced rate for my meal to save money on a party I was paying for entirely. Natasha's composure finally cracked completely. We were trying to manage expenses responsibly. You were humiliating your son's mother at her own birthday celebration to save $50 on a party that cost me $3,500.
So you did research whether Isabella was actually suited for Elite's program? You consulted with her current coach about her potential and what would be best for her development? Their silence was answer enough. I stood up, feeling stronger and more clear-headed than I had in years. Here's what's going to happen, I announced. I'm immediately stopping all financial support to your family. No more mortgage payments, no more tuition, no more emergency funds, no more vacation money. You're both capable adults with good earning potential, and it's time you started living within your actual means. You can't be serious, Christopher said, his voice desperate. We'll lose the house. The girls will have to change schools. You have options. Accept the financial aid at Sacred Heart Academy. Move to a house you can actually afford. Live like the middle-class family you actually are, instead of pretending to be wealthy on my retirement savings. What about the girls? Natasha demanded. What about their stability, their education, their futures? Their futures will be just fine once their parents start taking financial responsibility, instead of relying on their grandmother to fund lifestyle choices beyond their means. I walked to my purse and pulled out a check I'd already written. This is $5,000. It's enough to cover your mortgage payment for 2 months while you figure out your next steps. After that, you're on your own financially. Christopher stared at the check like it was a foreign object. Mom, please, we can work this out. If you're upset about the party, we can talk about it. I'm not upset about the party, Christopher. I'm upset about 3 years of being financially exploited while being treated as less valuable than the people I was supporting. I'm upset about being lied to, manipulated, and humiliated by people I trusted. We never meant to hurt you, he said, and for the first time that evening, his voice sounded genuinely remorseful. But you did hurt me, and you did it systematically, deliberately, while taking my money and lying to our community about who was supporting whom. Natasha had been quiet during this exchange, but now she stood up with the imperious dignity that had once intimidated me. Fine, if this is how you want to treat your family, if you care more about money than about your son and granddaughters, then maybe it's better if we don't have a relationship at all. I looked at her calmly. Natasha, I spent $130,000 supporting your family over 3 years. I paid for your lifestyle, your children's education, your mortgage, your vacations, and even my own birthday party. The idea that I care more about money than family is absurd. Then why are you cutting us off? Because I finally understand that you don't see me as family. You see me as a funding source. And I'm too old and have too little time left to waste it on people who value my checkbook more than my humanity. Christopher gathered up Isabella and Sophia, both girls crying now, though they didn't understand why their family dinner had turned into such an ugly confrontation. As they prepared to leave, he turned back to me one last time. "Mom, if you do this, if you cut off support, things will be very different between us." "I know," I said sadly, "but things have been different for a long time. I was just too lonely and too desperate to feel needed to see it clearly." They left without another word, the door closing behind them with a finality that echoed through my small house. Over the next month, I learned exactly what my financial support had been worth in terms of family access. Christopher stopped calling. Sunday dinners ended abruptly. When I tried to make plans to see Isabella and Sophia, I was told they were busy with activities and commitments. Natasha blocked my number after I called to ask about attending Sophia's violin recital. When I showed up at Sacred Heart Academy to watch Isabella's gymnastics demonstration, I was informed that my name had been removed from the approved family pickup list. The message was clear. If I wasn't funding their lifestyle, I wasn't welcome in their lives. But something unexpected happened during those lonely weeks. Other people began reaching out to me. Margaret Kellerman invited me to join her book club. Dr. Patricia Henley called to check on my well-being after hearing rumors about family discord. Mrs. Patterson from next door started inviting me for coffee and conversation. Most surprisingly, I received a call from Vivian Crawford, Natasha's sister from Boston, who had heard about our family conflict through the social media gossip networks that connected wealthy women across New England. "Mrs. Rosewood," Vivian said, "I hope you don't mind me calling, but I felt I needed to reach out after hearing about what happened with Christopher and Natasha." "I'm not sure what you've heard," I said carefully. "I heard that you'd stopped providing financial support and that they'd cut off your access to your granddaughters in response. And I have to tell you, I think you did the right thing." Her statement caught me off guard. "Really?" "Mrs. Rosewood, I've watched my sister manipulate people for money since we were children. She's incredibly skilled at identifying generous people and finding ways to make them feel responsible for her lifestyle choices. What she did to you, she's done to others." Vivian went on to tell me about Natasha's pattern of targeting older family members and family friends for financial support. Always presenting herself as struggling and deserving, always making her benefactors feel special and needed, while gradually increasing their financial contributions.
She did it to our aunt in Providence, convinced her to fund their wedding and first house down payment. She did it to Elliot's grandfather before he died, getting him to change his will to leave her money that was supposed to go to other family members. You're not the first person she's manipulated, and you probably won't be the last. The conversation with Vivian confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. I hadn't been helping a struggling young family during a difficult period. I'd been the latest victim in Natasha's long-term strategy of using emotional manipulation to fund her lifestyle aspirations. But the story doesn't end with my isolation and heartbreak, because 3 weeks after I'd cut off financial support, I received an unexpected phone call that would give me the opportunity to ensure that Christopher and Natasha faced real consequences for their behavior. "Mrs. Rosewood, this is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Hartford County Elder Abuse Investigation Unit. We've received a complaint about potential financial exploitation involving your family, and we'd like to speak with you about your experiences." It turned out that Vivian Crawford had contacted the authorities after our conversation, providing them with information about Natasha's pattern of targeting elderly family members for financial manipulation. My case was part of a larger investigation into what appeared to be systematic elder abuse. I met with Detective Martinez the following day, bringing all the documentation I'd gathered about the financial transfers, the lies about their circumstances, and the manipulation tactics they'd used to maintain my support. "Mrs. Rosewood," Detective Martinez said after reviewing everything, "what you've described meets the legal definition of financial elder abuse. The systematic manipulation, the false representations about their circumstances, the deliberate isolation when you questioned their behavior, these are all classic patterns we see in exploitation cases. What can be done about it?"
We can file criminal charges, but that's a difficult process and would require your testimony. Alternatively, we can work with you to recover some of the funds through civil proceedings, especially since much of the money was obtained through fraudulent representations. I thought about Isabella and Sophia, about how criminal charges against their parents would affect their lives and their futures. Despite everything that had happened, I didn't want my granddaughters to suffer for their parents' choices. What about the civil option? We could demand full restitution of the funds obtained through fraud, plus penalties. Given the documented evidence of deception, they'd likely be forced to repay a significant portion of what they took. 2 weeks later, Christopher and Natasha received legal notification demanding repayment of $89,000, the amount I'd contributed that could be proven to have been obtained through false representations about their financial circumstances. They had 30 days to respond or face formal civil proceedings. Christopher called me within hours of receiving the legal documents, his voice shaking with panic and rage. "Mom, how could you do this to us? We're family." "Family members don't lie to each other for years to steal retirement savings," I replied calmly. "We never stole anything. You gave us that money willingly." "I gave you money based on lies about your circumstances. That's fraud, Christopher." "We'll lose everything, the house, the cars, the girls' school." "You'll lose the lifestyle you built on my money while lying to me about your ability to afford it yourselves. That's not the same as losing everything." They tried to negotiate, offering to pay back smaller amounts over longer periods. They promised to change their behavior, to treat me better, to include me more in family decisions. They even offered to give me a formal role in family financial planning, as if being allowed to participate in managing my own exploitation was some kind of privilege. But I'd learned too much about who they really were to be swayed by promises and emotional appeals. The people who had treated me like hired help at my own birthday party, who had instructed caterers not to waste food on me while I paid for the entire event, who had called me paranoid and selfish for asking basic questions about their financial management, those people weren't going to transform into loving, respectful family members just because they were facing consequences for their behavior. In the end, they were forced to sell their West Hartford house and move to a modest colonial in a less expensive area. Natasha returned to work as a dental hygienist. The girls transferred to public school, where they received an excellent education without the social pressures of Sacred Heart Academy's competitive environment. And me? I used the money they repaid to renovate my house, to travel to places Theodore and I had always dreamed of visiting, and to establish a scholarship fund at Millbrook Elementary School for children from families who couldn't afford educational enrichment programs. I also did something I'd never expected to do at 70 years old. I started dating. Harold Peterson, a retired teacher who'd been widowed the same year I lost Theodore, began taking me to dinner and movies and community theater performances. For the first time in years, I was valued for my conversation, my humor, my intelligence, rather than my bank account. 6 months after I'd stopped funding their lifestyle, Christopher reached out to ask if we could rebuild our relationship. The family was struggling financially, but they were managing. The girls had adjusted to public school and made new friends. Natasha was working full-time and had apparently gained some perspective on the damage her manipulation had caused.
"I know I hurt you, Mom," Christopher said during our first coffee meeting in months. "I know we took advantage of your generosity and treated you badly. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for a chance to be your son again, instead of someone who sees you as a solution to financial problems." It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. We're rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries about money and mutual respect. I see the girls regularly now, but in contexts where I am valued as their grandmother rather than their funding source. Isabella is thriving in recreational gymnastics, and Sophia has joined the public school's excellent orchestra program. Natasha and I will never be close, but she treats me with the basic courtesy she should have shown from the beginning. She learned, perhaps too late, that alienating the person who'd been supporting your lifestyle isn't a sustainable strategy for long-term financial security. As for me, I'm 70 years old, financially secure, surrounded by people who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide, and finally free from the exhausting work of trying to buy love from people who were never willing to sell it at any price. The woman who was once told she wasn't worth wasting food on now knows exactly what she's worth, and she's not willing to accept anything less than the respect and dignity she deserves. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. Have you ever been taken advantage of by family members? Have you found yourself funding other people's lifestyles while being treated poorly? What would you do if you discovered your generosity was being exploited? Comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, I'm leaving 2 other videos on the screen that explore similar themes about family relationships and financial boundaries. Thank you for watching until the end.